Once again, welcome to the second episode in this series of three spring series of conversations. We're meeting for the second time with our special guest as part of this series. I'm Sandro De Bono. I'm an associate lecturer of the Department of Arts, Open Communities and Adult Education, and Carmel Borch is here with us today as well to take part in this conversation too. May I remind you that this conversation is being recorded and that it will be available also on our YouTube channel. I'd like to welcome Linda Norris. Hello, Linda. How are you?
Hello, I'm so happy to join you all.
The pleasure is all ours. We're live from Malta, from Spazio Creative, the Center for Creativity, and you're in New York, right?
Well, I'm actually in New York State. I am and have been all year I live in a village of 200 people. So it's not the New York people imagine.
Fantastic. Right. So a brief introduction. Linda is Senior Specialist in Methodology and Practice at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. She will be mentioning the coalition for sure. It's a worldwide network of 200 members in 55 countries that activates the power of place, of memory to engage the public with a deeper understanding of the past and inspire action to shape the future. Linda Norris plays a key role in the coalition's training offerings and is very active. I'm sure she will be mentioning most of her work at the coalition. As co-author of Creativity in Museum Practice, then, Linda is also an international leader in facilitating conversation and action surrounding the ways creativity can transform museums. And in fact, her book, which she co-authored also way back in 2014, I believe it's still very relevant, and I enjoyed reading it very much, Linda, as well. She is an adjunct instructor at the Johns Hopkins University Online Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage Program. And she was also a Fulbright Scholar to Ukraine in 2009. Well, her CV speaks volumes about Linda's work, but believe me, when you get to know the person, you will understand that Linda is a very special person, an inspiring person who has done lots of work internationally and also in the US. Linda, I leave the mic, I pass on the mic to Carmel, to my colleague, to start off with the first question.
Hi,
Great.
Linda.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, Linda, hi, welcome. Very
you.
warm welcome, first of all, from a very warm, already a warm, country. So let's cut to the chase and go straight to the first question. One word that seems to be, so to speak, associated with your being as a specialist in methodology and practice is creativity. So let's focus on creativity first. Now, of course, like any other concept, like any other phenomenon, the concept creativity is a contested concept. So there are multiple meanings associated with the term creativity. As far as I'm concerned, for example, I closely associate creativity coming from a social justice, perspective with critical thinking and critical engagement with the word. So whilst we are engaging with the word, we are creating knowledge, and that act of creation is an act of creativity itself. So that's where I'm coming from. So in your estimate, how would you define creativity in the context of, museum practice?
So I want to start with by saying that my co-author, Rainey Tisdale, and I totally believe that everyone is born creative. So creativity is not the province of only artists, visual or writers or whatever. All of us have that ability, but it's really like riding a bicycle, it's honed by practice. So which is why we called our book Creativity in Practice. So our working definition, as we think about what creative museum practice, we work within that framework, is about producing new ideas and ways of seeing things that add value either internally within a museum structure or externally to the communities we work with. It's about moving humankind forward individually. Sometimes that's an exploration within your own self, and in broader community and societal ways. We think creative activities must have value in some ways. We can talk more about what that value means. The good news for all of us as museum workers is that we are surrounded when we're at work, which is not possible for everyone right now, but it appears to be coming back, where creative efforts of centuries are on display. And I mean everything from a Rembrandt to a plow that are all evidence of creative work. So we believe creative work is about new or additive ideas that make the world better.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you get where I'm coming from. I'm extremely sensitive to the idea that, we all have this potential for creativity, but unfortunately, not all of us are heard or seen in our act of creativity. Now, how can we ensure as a museum community, as a museum space, that there is creative justice, so to speak, within the museums?
That's a great, creative justice is a great term. I think the answer to this is easy but hard to implement. It's about opening up any museum to new voices and to new knowledge systems. And so when I think about, Stephen Weil, the American museologist, wrote a long time ago at this point, that the change in the late 20th century was about museums being about something to being for somebody, that shift. But I think now the approach is that museums are with somebody. So we're not for and we're not about, but we're with. So really thinking about how we open up to new voices. But I think it's also important for all of us who work in and with museums to understand that it's not just about the performative act of having a community advisory committee that meets once. It's really about, for all of us, beginning to understand the systems of oppression and racism that museums exist in, that were founded as a result of, and in some cases continue to embrace. So that opening up to voices, that polyphonic definition that ICOM worked on for a while, has to be within the museum and has to be also about serious efforts to change museum leadership and museum systems. Mm-hmm. So we can't just look externally, we have to take hard looks inside our organizations.
Yeah. My area of expertise, or at least one of the areas of expertise, is transformative, learning and transformative education. Now I spend, I don't know how many hours, trying to form prospective educators into thinking transformatively. And that is not an easy task to move from, as you said, a person who has been socialized intellectually and emotionally into oppression, and to come out of that oppression in a transformative way. Are you confident that, there are people within museums who are really prepared, intellectually and emotionally to open up, to this polyphony of voices as you described it?
Yes, absolutely. Are they in every museum yet? No. Are they at the leadership of every museum yet? No. But I think your point about education and learning is so important, because so much of our learning as museum professionals, as scholars, as other kinds of people, is about, we're going to learn knowledge and we're going to impart it, right? That's generally been the way we've thought about what the museum field is important. And I think as we think about training future museum leaders, we have to train them, one, into the idea that they need to be great learners for their whole life. Mm-hmm. And they need to understand that there are many, many, many different systems of knowledge, of which academic knowledge is only one. So that I think there's lots of work to do about training future leaders we now at the coalition, many of the trainings we do actually start with kind of a look at what the process of creativity is as a way of helping people understand their own process and helping other people understand it. But I think I don't think everybody in every museum is there yet, but I'm always hopeful.
So what is in your view the indispensable, what are in your view the indispensable qualities of, you know, a transformative museum curator, educator, cultural worker, etc.?
I would say bravery and curiosity.
Mhm.
I would put those two.
Yeah. Perhaps one final question from my part before I pass on to Sandro. Of course, for transformation to happen in any space, be it museum, be it school, be it wherever, I think there needs to be two very important elements. One element is, of course, consciousness building, and the other one is, of course, action. And basically, the transformative, you know, museum educator, museum person lives in between, you know, these two elements. Now, you've got tons of experience. Can you share with us a few concrete examples of, you know, this transformative, you know, experience happening concretely in a museum space?
Sure. A couple examples from, I'll use sites of conscience examples because they are great at turning memory to action. A couple, for instance, to start with, here's a really interesting one that I think will begin to transform the way people think about the past. The Migration Museum in Adelaide, Australia, is working on a new permanent exhibit, but they've made a real shift. If you think about migration exhibits, almost anywhere in the world, they're told from the perspective of the settler colonists, because to be honest, that's what most of those migration museums, right? Somebody comes from somewhere, colonizes somewhere. It's always told from the perspective of like, we're arriving. That's the voice. The Migration Museum is redoing their exhibit to center the indigenous voice in the exhibition. Not we're arriving, but what happened to us when people came. That's a huge shift in perspective as an institution I find really interesting. But I also think it's going to begin to shift and be a part of a larger shift in the way that Australians think about their relationship with Indigenous Australians. That's one. Another one, the Kagali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda has programs where they bring victims and survivors of the genocide together. But I think their most inspiring program that I got to see a bit of in person at one point was they run, using the lessons of that very difficult history, a peace leadership program that trains kind of young, late teenagers, 20-somethings about the concepts of peace and reconciliation, and then provide small stipends so those young people go out and start programs in their communities. That ripple effect is changing communities. So those are just two examples of many as ways in which transformation really is beginning to happen. And of course, we should always acknowledge that transformation is never immediate and it's never straightforward.
Yeah. And if you don't mind, Sandra, I have an extra question. I'm getting revved up now, you know?
Please.
This is such an interesting
I'm glad we can do
conversation. It's up my alley, of course. I'm sure in the course of your, you know, professional life, you've been confronted by people that, you know, there's no space for politics in museums. How would you normally, you know, respond to this idea that, or this pretension or this illusion that museums are, you know, neutral or innocent spaces?
Well, I think when people say that, they're not acknowledging that museums have always been political. It's just been the politics that they've agreed with. Right. So whether it's, you know, museums in the US who have a kind of melting pot narrative and for a long time have been, you know, museums were it was hard to confront difficult issues and particularly around the issues of race in this country. the ways in which museums all over display works that have been looted and stolen from the global South, that's politics. It's inescapably here. We know it. We're just beginning to shift the dynamics about what that means. But I totally disagree with the people who say museums should not engage in politics, because we engage all the time. And I just think there's more understanding of it, and there's more understanding that it cannot be a single kind of politics we engage in.
Mm-hmm. Sandro.
Thank you, Carmel. We're already getting our first questions, but I'll move on, and then we'll pick up on what Michalina has been sharing already, and Jose Antonio. I'd like to take you back to March of last year, when you were interviewed by Paul Orselli of POW. And something that struck me, which you shared during this webinar, and we've got a visual here as well of what you stated, is this. Now, think about all the other parts of the world that are doing this. We don't need to learn just from museums. Now, when I heard you say this, I immediately thought of your work within the Alliance of Sites of Conscience. And perhaps it could be interesting to know from your experience what museums can actually learn from what is happening within this network, and if there are any best practices that you can share.
So it's great to talk about the coalition, and I hope people who are listening will also explore our website at some point and learn more about it. The coalition is a fully unusual organization, the only one in the world that brings together both human rights activists and museum and historic site people, cultural people. On our staff, we have a mix of people. Our members are a mix of all that, our 300 members, organizational members in 66 countries. So I've had the opportunity to learn from human rights activists about work. I should say in a general way, I think museums can learn from anything. You can learn from what markets do. You can learn from what libraries do. You can learn from what baseball teams do. All those things. But a couple lessons. One, I want to flag a little bit that I think the notion of best practices is a Western European American construct that may not be useful in the whole world. The idea that the same thing that works great in Chicago works great in a village in Senegal, it probably doesn't. So one, I want to flag that our lessons are that every situation is different. That's someone we really think about. And other important lessons, many of our member sites around the world are founded by victims and survivors or their families. So they bring direct lived experience into the conversation, which is so often, it's funny to go back to bravery again, but I totally believe the kind of bravery and courage and the belief, really honestly, that for those members, sites are transformational, they're not neutral, and they are tools. That there's this deep belief that museum people are like, we get all nervous about it, but other people are like, yes, we're a human rights organization, but we founded a museum because we think it's a way to create change. So that making a difference is great. In the US, often when museums talk about advocacy, for instance, it's often about advocacy for increases in governmental funding, which is not much in the US, but anyway, it exists, or other issues that affect museums directly. Many sites of conscience, all of our sites of conscience really, are advocates about bigger issues that affect all of us. The responsibility of truth commissions, about the recognition of stories untold, all kinds of issues about human rights, that the museums themselves are advocates for that. And so I think it's that's a really important best practice, is that we don't exist outside of the world. We exist in the cultures, in a global context now. We're all in this together. And I think museums have to take action.
Great, lots of thought, lots of things to consider and to think about. My second question is about space, and it's also a statement. I think this is coming from the book, and we have a visual as well. We'll be showing it for a few seconds here. Space is an instrument, not a given condition. And I was intrigued. I was intrigued by the statement. And can you explain more what you really meant with the statement? I mean,
I have to say, this is a statement where I had to go back and I was like, did we really say that?
Yeah, well.
So I'll have my take now, which might not necessarily be my take then. I think for us now, right, all of us have learned so much about the digital space as an instrument. We've become great at using it. Having this conversation, we could not have done that before. And there's absolutely, one of our members is an organization called Gulag CZ, based in the Czech Republic, who is working on documenting every gulag in the former Soviet Union. That's an incredible project, and that's about the use of the digital space. I also think there's something really, some of our other members are doing some really interesting things that thinking about having us rethink some of the spaces, physical spaces that we live in. Two really similar projects. The Last Address project in Russia puts, it's much like the Stolpersteine, the other project that you see all over Europe, but the Last Address project puts plaques on the outside of buildings of people who were disappeared and murdered during the Stalin era. That space exists in one way to the people who live there. Now it's the building you live in, you come home. Part of the process of that organization putting up the plaques is the conversation with that building's residents today. And so all of a sudden space becomes something different, the own physical space you live in. In the US, the Middle Passage Markers Project is marking disembarking spaces for the transatlantic slave trade. And that was everywhere along the East Coast. So the idea of thinking about these spaces in different kinds of ways. And then of course, we do have members who don't have access to the spaces they would like to think about. So in some ways, right, we have to think about, it becomes an internal thinking about a space and then thinking about how to make that external, that thinking external. So I think space is, it's an instrument. It's how we choose to think about it, but then it's also how we choose to think about it, you know, in our museums and historic sites. What are the experiences about? How does our whole self experience a physical space?
I have just one last question, and then we'll be taking all the questions coming in, comments, keep them coming, and some really, really good comments here. I'm sure this is something that struck a lot of people, because we tweeted it a few days ago, and you retweeted and you said, yes, this is it. And we have a visual of this. Strategically, throw out the rules. And for me, as an ex-museum director, hearing this statement was a bit of a, no, I mean, okay, can you actually throw out the rules in a strategic way?
Of course, you always can. You don't want to throw all the rules out, because, you know, traffic lights exist for a reason, right? Yes. Traffic lights are a rule. They exist for a reason. But the other things exist for a reason, and museums, and this is right, we're circling back to the idea about best practice. Best practices are rules. Let's be clear, they're rules.
Okay.
are they the most important rules? And it's very interesting, right? In the US, the issues around deaccessioning of objects in museums, like during the pandemic, people have been willing to, organizations and professional organizations have been willing to change rules that they previously said, oh, could never be changed. That's a whole nother conversation that's out of my expertise, but all of a sudden it's like, oh, we can throw out those rules, which were really ostensibly about helping museums survive. But think about the rules. Museums, we love rules, right? We have to catalog everything. I once was at a front desk where a front desk worker made the person standing in front of her, a visitor, throw out their gum. Like she held out something and said, spit out your gum. And I was like, oh. Why do we have to have so many rules about visitors? Why are we not open the hours that people can come, but the hours we like to work? Why do you, as we hire new professionals, require graduate degrees? So I think there's all kinds of rules, and I think the question is to really think about all your rules and why they exist, because lots of rules, particularly in institutions, right? It's because we've always done it that way and no one has ever really questioned it.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, indeed.
So yeah, I think that it's about the process of questioning.
Indeed. We've got two questions. I'll pick one of these two by Jose Antonio Gordillo Martorell. I know he's a keen follower of our series of webinars. Hi, Jose Antonio. He's asking about the efficient methodology for you to improve, support, manage, and feed collaborative creativity of a local community connected to a museum. What would be the efficient methodology for one to improve and support, manage, and feed collaborative creativity in a local museum?
So that's a great question. And I think there's two keys to it. I don't know if they're efficient, so I'll reserve that part of it. But first is actually going out to listen. Observe the places in your community where creativity happens. And that also really means varying the kinds of information that you take in. So, and particularly once things open up, go to not just to other museums or engage in other cultural institutions. Go have coffee or a drink in a part of town you never go to. That's, begin to kind of expand your universe of what you know physically about your community and the people you know. And then I think the other way is that I think museums work best, and we're learning this now, when we work in partnership with communities. So whether it's, partnering with groups of artists, whether it's partnering with people who want to make social change through art, whether it's partnering through, gardening groups who are thinking about creativity in that way. So I think listening, getting out there, and then looking for partnerships and understanding that all of that doesn't happen overnight. That's the efficient part. I'm sorry, Jose, I can't get you to, but it is, and the benefits will be so great as you listen and you work in partnership.
Great. There's another question from Michalina Petelska, our colleague from the University of Gdansk. Hello, Michalina. She's mentioning the fact that her students, to her surprise, some of these young people say that they prefer a museum that is more traditional. Some students say that some museums should remain temples of art and history. I emphasize, this is what Michalina is saying, I emphasize that it is about the surprising opinion of young people. What do you say? What would you say to these students in such a situation?
So one of the things I want to know, those are museum studies students.
Yes.
Can I assume that?
Yes.
I think museum studies attract in a general, museum studies is not attracting, I would say, generally speaking, activists. It's attracting people who love museums as they are. So, and I think so they are pretty conservative. And it's not to say that being a place of social justice and activism and being a place of reflection and deep thinking, those are not mutually exclusive. Museums can be both.
Well, this is interesting. Someone, a comment like that coming from someone who is into museum studies, who teaches at Johns Hopkins, is a very powerful statement there. There's another question by Luz Maceira Ochoa. Hello, Luz. Hope all well. And she states, sometimes victims and survivors do not have precisely a creative or innovative approach. They have their views, grief, resilience, demands, experience, etc., but can hold a defensive or self-centered perspective. How can we promote creativity and openness without attempting to their views or possibilities?
So we actually at the coalition, particularly through our transitional justice program, which is a part of the coalition's work, do a lot of different things with art and healing. As a way of finding, one, because we believe everyone is born creative. And I think part of the process of resilience and those stories is to begin to move towards healing through, we work a lot with a process called body mapping, which is a way of drawing your whole full-size body and telling your story, drawing and mapping your story. One of our members in Nepal has done a great kind of quilt project about where people embroider kind of their stories. So I think providing creative outlets is a really interesting way. There are poetry projects, there are all kinds of things, but I also think that a really important part of the coalition's work, and that our members do in all kinds of different ways, sites do in all kinds of different ways, is the value of dialogue. And I think about pretty early when I came to the coalition 4 or so years ago, I attended a body mapping workshop with Sri Lankan women in Sri Lanka. And these women were from, they spoke 3 different languages, they were 3 different religions, they and their families had been on different sides during the Civil War. And so they all had perspectives, they all had victim stories. Whether your husband was a sergeant in the army or a resistance fighter, losing your husband is losing your husband. And so I think the ways in which we come together to tell these broader stories is about really beginning to listen to other people and to understand that we're all human, that we all want the same things. We want peace, we want security for our family, we want economic sustainability, we want respect for who we are. So the more ways that you can bridge across difference, the more important it is. So I think and really interesting, creative and important things come out of that. And to be honest, as you work with victims and family survivors, you might find more than you ever expected.
There's one last question before.
Go ahead.
Carmel takes over with his questions, with more interesting questions, and it's also coming from Jose Antonio, and he's asking, Linda, how do you think is the best way to work with children in terms of creativity? What do you think about the spiral of creativity of Mitchell Resnick from MIT? Imagine, create, play, share, reflect.
So I think about my own schooling, when there was always a right way to do something, right? And often working with children is like, we're gonna do this. A great example of working with children, a lot of our members work with children around really difficult, challenging issues, but the museum I really want to shout out as a quite amazing example is the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo, because their work both about the stories from grown-ups when they were children and their work with children now is about really respecting the fact that children are, are agents. They're not just empty receptacles for us. And I also think about what somebody from the Tenement Museum said to me years ago about a project they had done. And she said, kids are natural activists, right? It's their nature. They don't know that it's hard to change things, so they want to try. I think we in our book use the kind of framework of creativity that Csikszentmihalyi, which I feel entirely sure I'm still mispronouncing all this time. And I think any of the creative frameworks are useful because they help us understand how we might go about it, whether it's with kids or adults. So so I think working with kids is about respecting kids.
Yeah. Okay, Linda, in the course of your answers, you've generated a lot of themes which are intimately connected to this concept of transformative, approach. You've mentioned the concept of voice, which is key, crucial, central, but you also mentioned the term healing, which is very important, in this context. Now, from my experience, at least, concrete experience, when it comes to healing, part of the process of healing is, coming to terms with one's, subjectivity, one's prejudices, etc., etc. How do you deal with such a situation concretely? Because I'm sure that, the processes that you've mentioned did generate emotions which are very difficult at times to manage. How do you manage such emotions?
And I think it's lots of things as we think about kind of a healing and reconciliation process in anywhere around the world. It's a framework. Sometimes people are looking for legal justice, right? That's a part of it, and sometimes that contributes to healing. That's not possible in every situation. So, okay, I'm gonna please ignore my phone in the background, which is my landline that never rings except when I'm on a call. So it's helping people understand what their options are, providing psychosocial support, which I think is something museums can be incredible at. Because part of what we have as museums, both in art and in history, is evidence of perseverance and dedication and healing. Those examples exist within our collections already. So an art museum has amazing stories to tell about healing and resilience if we choose to think about it that way. And I will say, I do believe that everywhere, even in my little town of 200 people, there's something that is a site of conscience. There is, 10 miles away, the displacement of farmers to build a reservoir. There are rent strikes of the 1840s. So everywhere we live, there is a need for kind of healing and reconciliation, but we need to begin peeling back to look at those truths and that history first. That's our first step.
Yeah. Obviously, I need to build on that, answer, because of course, we're talking about museum spaces which are open, museum spaces which are democratic spaces, and therefore, we are assuming that people are coming into, the museums with their own knowledge. Now, that knowledge needs to be affirmed. That knowledge needs to be validated, but some knowledge is not worth validating because it's, informed by racism, perhaps, by homophobia, perhaps, by sexism, perhaps. How do you deal with such knowledges in the process of healing, dialogue, call it what you want?
That's a really great question. And I have to say, in the US right now, a really challenging question for society as a whole, not just museums, is how do we bridge those differences? And I wish if I had a great answer, I guess I would be in charge of world peace, and I'm not. I think we just have to understand that change comes one person at a time. That's what it is. So if you're listening, if you're asking a question about, well, why is it you think that, what has led you to think that? Sorry, you've asked me a question that I don't have a good answer to, other than it's really hard work, but we have to try.
Okay. You mentioned several places, you moved from Rwanda to the US, to the Czech Republic. Do you see connections between, the different sites of practice there, or are they seen as individual, localized sites?
So the coalition works in a couple different ways. So I can explain specifically. We have regional networks because, for instance, the Latin American network, is the majority of those members for a long time were legacies of the Latin American dictatorships, although that's beginning to change. We have an African network, we have a North American network. So there's regional connections. But we're also finding, and actually just this week has been the first of 3 global meetings for members this year. So this week, members from around the world have been coming together to discuss issues of systemic racism. And that, to think about when there are participants from Latin America, from the US, from Europe, from Asia, that conversation is different, right? The contexts are different. But the issue is a connecting thread. And for our members, we ask when organizations become members that there are 4 key principles that they consider. And they are, 1, that place is a part of their work. So it might be place, the building where something happened, but it might be Cambodia, right? We're pretty broad-minded about place. 2, that the people most affected by the story, that their voices get a chance to be heard. 3, that those who visit or engage with the site in whatever space that is, have opportunities for positive action, right? We want people to do something. And lastly, that all of our sites, in whatever the context, embrace the idea that justice and human rights is for everyone, that there should be a universal culture of justice and human rights. So those are connecting threads.
Okay. Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned, of course, inevitably, COVID. And of course, COVID did bring, some drastic, changes in terms of, for example, methodologies, for consciousness building. Can you give us a sense of what has changed over the past, 12 to 14 months as far as, connectivity, consciousness building is concerned?
And so as an organization, we were lucky because we already did global work. So we already knew how to do it to some degree. But I think a couple of things have changed. One, in lots of parts of the world, the shutdowns related to COVID have really emboldened authoritarian leaders to crack down on human rights. So we see that affecting our members, we see that affecting museums. And so that's an aspect of COVID that's really troubling, and we'll see what happens. I think in a kind of museum functioning kind of way, I feel like many museums, because we take the long view, right? That's part of what we do. It just took forever to make a change, to be different, right? Museums were slow, really. All of a sudden, COVID and the idea that you had to think about being online meant that museums had to move faster. They had to be more adaptive. And I think that's the lesson. And I think it's so important. And right, COVID and the larger, really global discussion around race and oppression, right? That those two things really, they accompany each other in the last year. And so I hope for museums and for all kinds of organizations that we don't return to normal, that that's the wrong thing for us to be doing, is that there has to be something new that we can't even envision yet, but that our best creative efforts together will bring us to something new.
Yeah, and perhaps COVID has exposed definitely the digital gap that exists globally. Has it affected your work?
We spend a lot of time hoping the connections work when we do. We produce about a webinar a week as an organization that are free and open to everyone, and then available on our website. And you know, many of our speakers are members from around the world, and whether it's in the US, where lots of kids, I live in a rural area with no cell phone service. So lots of kids in urban areas, in rural areas, you know, when you're like, schools are online and you can't be online, and museums are like, we're going to provide content. And it's like, oh, you're only providing content for people who have internet access. And so we, you know, we're always trying to figure out ways to overcome that. And I have to say, our members around the world in places where internet access is not great, or there's, you know, offloading power, whatever, are really incredible at finding ways to engage with us.
Sandro, thanks.
More questions coming from our participants. Two questions coming from Jose Antonio and Luz Maceira Ochoa, which refer also to the COVID circumstances. Jose Antonio mentions the idea of the museum as a space for a cure. No, and he also quotes a singer who talks about the museum nursery concept. And then Luz builds on that, and in fact she asks, I mean, does that cure nursery idea, I mean, is it compatible with the amazement and pressure and other wow factors and ludic character of the museums? She's talking about whether this nursery concept, the idea of the museum as a nursery for the community to heal from the COVID-19 pandemic circumstances, is it compatible then with the wow factor and with the amazement that comes with museums?
So I think it's interesting. Do people go to museums for the wow factor? I have to think about whether I think that's always true. And I think, you know, people go to museums for so many reasons. And my colleague Braden and I were talking today about the idea about museums being places for our whole selves, our emotional selves, our intellectual selves, our physical selves, that all of those experiences, museums can be places for all of those. And to also understand that we don't go to museums for just one thing, right? And so I think of museums as not a wow factor, but that there's the wow for me as a visitor, I guess I'll speak as a visitor, is the unexpected discovery factor, which is different than a wow factor. So I think, but for me, that discovery of something is also the kind of restorative healing part of it. And sometimes it's about a story I didn't know, or a perspective I didn't know, or was different than what I knew. And sometimes it's about an artwork itself. So I think they're absolutely compatible.
I think we have time for one last question, and Anne-Marie de Wild from the Amsterdam Museum. Hi, Anne-Marie. I'm glad that you managed to join our webinar. She got in touch this afternoon to check on on whether she could join, by all means. We're always open to have as many participants to these webinars as we can. And she's asking an interesting question. I mean, how can you reconcile the dialogue about controversial subjects with the most common way of museum communication? Objects with labels and museum text. It's a bit of a practical.
So one, it's great to have Anne-Marie, who's an old dear friend and someone I greatly admire. So a couple ways. I think one, I think we have to think about what we think that exhibition text is doing. I think it's, several years ago, I saw a great exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian, the New York branch, in which every object had a label written by 3 different labels. A label written by a Native American, a label written by an anthropologist, and a label written by an art historian. So one, I think reconciling that is the, one way is multiple voices, but the other way, I think it's really interesting. And sometimes I wonder whether we're kind of kidding ourselves. Is the dialogue between the object, the label, and the visitor, or is the dialogue somewhere else? Is it a dialogue between the object, the visitor, and whoever they're with? Or how can we build, I think the really interesting ways to think about it are how can we build ways for visitors to really talk to each other, the people they came with, and to be honest, even better, maybe people they didn't come with. How can we build those conversations? Sometimes I think it's through great asking questions on labels. Sometimes the hard part about audio tours is that it puts us in our own bubbles and it doesn't put us in conversation. So I think really experimenting with alternate kinds of labels, providing spaces for visitors to have feedback, I think that begins to wrestle that dialogue. But I think it requires that the institution, curators or whoever, be willing to surrender a little or a lot of their control over that label. Mm-hmm. And we all know the statistics about how long people spend reading those labels that we spent so long writing. So, there's the Little Museum in Dublin has a great thing at the start of a museum visit that says, so you notice there's not very many labels here. And here's why. Yeah. So I think we experiment with approaches.
Mm-hmm. Linda, I kept thinking about the issue of the wow factor. This idea that, learning is fun, that museums are for fun, that museums are for edutainment, so to speak. Do you see space for fun in a museum space which is committed to healing, for example? Do they sit comfortably together, fun, entertainment, and the serious business of, healing?
So it's interesting, right? We don't ask that question about movies, right? Mm-hmm. We watch serious movies as entertainment. So yes, I'm trying to think of a good example for you. I think, right, the museum field always uses the word entertainment as kind of a pejorative, right? But if we think about movies, if we think about books we read, right? Hard fiction from time immemorial has been both about healing and about entertainment. So yeah, I think there are absolutely spaces for those things to exist.
And perhaps one final question, Sandro, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Your idea, Linda, of museums as hopeful spaces.
So when you think about it, museums are about perseverance in some way, right? If you think that artists persevere, people who do things persevere, oppressed peoples have persevered. so in that way, I think there's a hope embedded in our work, but it's now at a point, I think, where one, we have to approach our work with hope, but with with the understanding that hope is not enough. Hope does not get you there, but it's something to aspire for. And I think when I think about our sites of conscience members, which include, art museums and historic sites and history museums, everything you can imagine, memory initiatives, they're all, if you believe in a universal culture of justice and human rights, then you have to be hopeful. And I also believe in a general way about all of the work we do, whether it's training or whatever, you receive what you put out to the world. So if you're leading a webinar and you're super energetic and interesting, then people will be energetic and interesting back. If your museum presents the idea that there is a better future if we all work towards it, that's what visitors receive. So I'm always hopeful about museums, and I've been in the field a long time, and I'm still hopeful, but I see how much work there is to do.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Linda. Sandra.
Sure.
So, Linda, it's been a delightful 1-hour conversation. We enjoyed it tremendously, and I probably can speak also on behalf of those who joined us today. Thank you once again. Thank you for your inspiring thoughts. Thank you for your provocations, and thank you for all the work you're doing with museums and with the sites of conscience all over the world. I'd like to wrap up this webinar by, first of all, thanking Spazio Creative once again, the Center for Creativity, who once again has hosted this series of webinars. Thank you. Thank you also to our sponsors and supporters, Valletta Cultural Agency and the Malta Tourism Authority as well. I'd like to remind all those who are following our webinar that we have our call for papers open until the 12th of June. And we sincerely hope and wish all those who are preparing their submission to refer to all the webinars, all the special guests that we hosted over the past weeks and months. We shall be meeting for our last webinar in this series, in the Spring Conversation series, on the 11th of June. We have a visual as well. And we'll be meeting with Danielle Kujtin, who is the director of Imagine IC in Amsterdam and also chair of ICOM-COMCOL, the International Committee for Collecting. Until then, goodbye. Saha.
From both of us.